The clinking of glasses was a delicate, constant music beneath the warm chatter of the wedding reception. From her seat at the head table, Sarah watched her brother, Robert, raise a flute of champagne to his new wife, his face illuminated by a kind of pure, unadulterated joy she hadn't seen in years. The soft glow of the fairy light strung across the ceiling of the old barn glittered in his eyes, and for a moment, Sarah felt her own heart swell with a matching happiness. This was a good day. A perfect day. She reached for her own glass. The buttery warmth of the Chardonnay a familiar comfort. Beside her, her husband of 15 years, Michael, applauded along with the other guests. A wide, easy smile on his face. He caught her eye and winked, a gesture so practiced, so uniquely theirs, that it momentarily smoothed over the faint, undefined anxieties that had been prickling at the edges of her mind for months. They were fine. Of course they were fine. He was Michael. She was Sarah. Together they were an institution, as solid and dependable as the old oak tree in their backyard. The best man was now telling a story about Robert's disastrous first attempt at fishing, and the room rumbled with laughter. Sarah leaned back, soaking it all in. The scent of roses and wax from the centerpieces, the low thrum of the bass from the band setting up in the corner, the sight of her family, whole and happy. It was in that moment of perfect contentment that she felt a small, insistent tug on the sleeve of her silk dress. She looked down to find her nephew Jack, his face flushed from chasing the other children around the dance floor. His tie was askew, and a smear of chocolate was already making its home on his crisp white shirt. He was 7, an age of unfiltered observations and earnest secrets. "Aunt Sarah," he whispered, his voice barely audible over the laughter. He leaned in closer, his breath warm against her ear. "Look under the table." Sarah smiled, a gentle, indulgent expression. "What is it, sweetie? Did you drop your toy car again?" She expected him to nod, to send her on a mission to retrieve a tiny metal truck from the forest of legs and dropped napkins. But Jack just shook his head, his eyes wide and serious. He pointed a slightly sticky finger downwards. "Just look." Her smile faltered for a second, a flicker of curiosity replacing it. She trusted Jack's earnestness. Glancing at Michael to ensure he was still engrossed in the speech, she casually bent over, pretending to adjust the strap of her shoe. The white linen tablecloth fell like a curtain, muffling the sounds of the party and enclosing her in a private, dimly lit world. Her eyes scanned the floor, past her own silver heels, past the solid, reassuring shape of Michael's dress shoes. And then she saw it. It wasn't a toy car. It was a foot. A woman's foot, encased in a blood-red stiletto that seemed to burn against the dark flooring. The shoe was impossibly high, the arch elegant and predatory. But it wasn't the shoe that made the air leave Sarah's lungs in a silent, painful rush. It was where it was resting. The pointed toe was placed deliberately, possessively, high on the calf of Michael's leg, the heel tracing a slow, almost imperceptible line against his trousers. Time seemed to slow down. The muffled laughter from beyond the tablecloth sounded distant, alien. Sarah's entire universe contracted to that single, shocking point of contact. The red shoe on her husband's leg. She knew that shoe. She had seen it earlier when she'd been introduced to Chloe, the bride's cousin. Chloe, with her bright, confident smile and a laugh that was just a little too loud. Her blood ran cold. She stayed there for a second that stretched into an eternity, crouched in the shadows, the evidence of a betrayal so blatant it felt like a physical blow. Her heart hammered against her ribs, a frantic, trapped bird. Slowly, as if moving through water, she pulled back, straightening her spine until her head rose above the tablecloth and she was back in the glittering, joyful room. Everything looked the same, but it was all different. A mirage. She looked at Michael. He was still smiling, his head turned towards the best man, but was the smile tighter now? Was there a tension in his jaw she hadn't noticed before? Then, her eyes slid down the long table, past smiling, oblivious relatives, until they found Chloe. She was seated 3 chairs down, next to an uncle from out of state. She was sipping her wine, but her eyes were not on the speaker. They were on Michael. As Sarah watched, Chloe's gaze flickered and met hers, and she smiled. It wasn't a big smile. It was a tiny, knowing, triumphant lift at the corner of her lips. It was a confirmation, a challenge. And in that instant, Sarah knew this wasn't an accident, a misunderstanding, or a fleeting flirtation. This was a war she hadn't even known she was fighting. The world snapped back into focus with a painful, jarring clarity. Sarah forced herself to take a breath, a shallow, ragged intake of air that burned her lungs. She turned her head away from Chloe, her gaze landing on the floral centerpiece as if it were the most fascinating object she had ever seen. A pink rose, just beginning to wilt at the edges, seemed to mock her with its transient beauty. One moment perfect, the next decaying. The best man finished his speech to a round of enthusiastic applause. Michael's hands clapped beside her, loud and certain. He turned to her, his face aglow. That was great. I didn't know Rob was that bad at fishing, he said, his voice full of the easy camaraderie that had always defined him. Sarah couldn't trust her own voice. She just nodded, managing a smile so tight it felt like it might crack her face. She picked up her wine glass, her fingers trembling almost imperceptibly. The cool liquid did nothing to quench the fire that was now raging in her stomach. Every nerve ending felt raw, exposed. She was suddenly aware of everything. The weight of her necklace against her skin, the hum of the air conditioning, the precise location of Michael's leg and how close it was to hers. She resisted the urge to flinch away from him. You okay? Michael's voice was soft, laced with what anyone else would call concern. You look a little pale. Just a bit warm, she managed to whisper, fanning her face with her hand in a gesture she hoped looked natural. It was a lie, of course. She had never felt so cold in her life. The master of ceremonies called the happy couple to the dance floor for their first dance. As Robert and his wife moved to the center of the room, a slow, romantic ballad began to play. The lights dimmed further, and a single spotlight found them, enclosing them in a bubble of bliss. They swayed together, lost in each other's eyes, oblivious to the drama unfolding in the shadows. For Sarah, the scene was a cruel parody. She remembered her own first dance with Michael 15 years ago. They had danced to the same song. She had rested her head on his shoulder, convinced that she was the luckiest woman in the world, that a love like theirs was a fortress, impenetrable and everlasting. Now that fortress was not just breached, it was being dismantled from the inside, stone by painful stone. Her mind began to race, a frantic Rolodex of the past few months. The late nights at the office he claimed were due to a big project. The way he now angled his phone away from her when a text came in. The sudden, intense interest in his fitness, the new gym membership, the expensive cologne she hadn't bought him. Each memory was a breadcrumb, a clue she had dismissed as a sign of a midlife crisis or simple stress. Now, they formed a path, and she could see with sickening clarity that they all led to one place. They led to Chloe. She remembered meeting her just a few hours ago, during the cocktail hour before the ceremony. The bride had introduced her as my adventurous cousin Chloe. Chloe had shaken Sarah's hand, her grip firm, her red-painted nails a vibrant slash of color. It's so wonderful to finally meet you, Chloe had said, her eyes lingering on Michael for a fraction of a second too long. I've heard so much about you both. At the time, Sarah had thought nothing of it. Now, the words echoed in her mind, dripping with a hidden meaning. I've heard so much about you. Of course she had. From Michael. How many of their private jokes, their shared histories, their intimate moments had he offered up to this other woman? The thought was a fresh wave of nausea. The first dance ended, and the band transitioned into a more upbeat tempo. Other couples began to flood the dance floor. The spell was broken. Michael turned to her, his familiar smile back in place. He stood up and extended his hand. Shall we? He asked, his voice still holding that warm, oblivious tone. Sarah stared at his outstretched hand. It was the same hand that had held hers when their son was born, the same hand that had wiped away her tears when her father passed away. It was the hand of the man she had promised to love, in sickness and in health, and now, all she could see was its betrayal. The thought of placing her own hand in his, of letting him lead her to the dance floor and hold her in his arms while the ghost of Chloe's red shoe danced between them, was unbearable. It felt like the ultimate act of self-deception. But to refuse, here, in front of everyone at her brother's wedding, it would be a scene. It would be the first visible crack in their perfect facade. For a long, agonizing moment, Sarah simply stared at Michael's hand. It hung in the space between them, a bridge to a life she thought she knew, a life that had just been revealed as a fragile illusion. Every instinct screamed at her to recoil, to snatch her own hand back and expose him right there, under the glittering fairy lights, in front of her entire family, to let the carefully constructed world they had built together shatter into a million irreparable pieces. But then she looked past him, her eyes catching the radiant face of her brother as he spun his new wife on the dance floor. This was his day, his perfect, untarnished day. She couldn't be the one to ruin it. She couldn't let Chloe's victory be that complete. With a resolve she didn't know she possessed, Sarah placed her hand in Michael's, His skin was warm and familiar, but the contact sent a jolt through her, a current of revulsion so strong it almost made her gasp. She allowed him to lead her onto the crowded floor, her body moving with a strange, robotic obedience. He pulled her close, his arm wrapping around her waist in a gesture that was meant to be intimate and protective. Tonight, it felt like a cage. The band was playing a classic, upbeat swing number. Around them, couples laughed and twirled, a sea of joyful motion. Michael tried to lead her into a simple turn, but her feet felt like lead. Her body, once so attuned to his, was now a stranger. "Relax, honey," he murmured into her ear, his breath warm. "You're so tense." Tense? The word was so inadequate, so ridiculously small for the cataclysm erupting inside her. She wanted to scream. Instead, she forced her muscles to loosen, leaning into him just enough to maintain the illusion. They began to move together, a hollow pantomime of the happy couple they were supposed to be. As they danced, her eyes scanned the crowd, searching, and there she was. Chloe was dancing with a portly, balding uncle who was sweating profusely, but her attention wasn't on her partner. Her gaze was fixed on them. Across the spinning couples, her eyes locked with Sarah's once again. The knowing smirk was back, a silent, vicious taunt. Chloe seemed to be enjoying this, feeding off Sarah's silent agony. She watched as Chloe laughed at something the uncle said, throwing her head back, the movement designed to draw attention to the long, elegant line of her throat. It was a performance. And Sarah was the unwilling audience. The betrayal was no longer just about sex. Sarah could, perhaps, eventually understand a moment of weakness, a foolish, regrettable mistake. But this was different. This was a calculated campaign. The foot under the table, the triumphant smiles, it was a declaration of war from a woman who wanted not just her husband, but her life. Chloe wasn't just sleeping with Michael. She was trying to replace Sarah. Michael spun her out, and for a brief second, she was at arm's length, free from his touch. The room swam before her eyes. He pulled her back in, his hand firm on her back. "See? You just needed to get into the rhythm," he said, oblivious. Utterly, completely oblivious. Or was he? Was this part of the act? Was he so arrogant, so confident in her ignorance that he could dance with his wife while his mistress watched from across the room? The thought made her feel dizzy. She rested her forehead against his shoulder, not out of affection, but because she was afraid her legs might give out. The scent of him, his familiar cologne mixed with the faint, starchy smell of his dress shirt, was suddenly suffocating. It was the scent of lies. How many times had he come home smelling like this? And she had wrapped her arms around him, burying her face in his neck, never once suspecting that the scent of another woman was clinging to his skin. The song finally, mercifully, came to an end. The dancers applauded, and Sarah stepped back from Michael's embrace the instant it loosened. He was already turning to her, a smile on his lips, probably ready to suggest another dance. She couldn't. She would break. "I need some air," she said, her voice surprisingly steady. She didn't wait for his response. "I'm just going to step outside for a minute. Is everything all right?" The concern in his voice was a masterpiece of deception. "Perfectly fine. Just a little overwhelmed," she replied, the words tasting like ash. "Too much happiness in one room, I guess." She turned and walked away, her steps measured and deliberate. She didn't run. She didn't look back. She could feel his eyes on her, perhaps confused, perhaps worried that his game was up. She could feel Chloe's eyes on her, cold and victorious. But most of all, she felt the crushing weight of 15 years of shared history, a history that had been rewritten in an instant by a single whispered sentence from a 7-year-old boy. She pushed open the heavy wooden door of the barn and stepped out into the cool night, the sounds of the party finally fading behind her. The night air was a shock, cool and crisp against her heated skin. It smelled of damp earth and distant rain, a clean, honest scent that was a welcome antidote to the cloying sweetness of the reception. Sarah walked away from the barn, her heels sinking slightly into the soft grass. She followed a gravel path that led to a small, ornamental garden, a quiet refuge away from the noise and the light. A wooden bench sat under the sprawling branches of a weeping willow, and she sank onto it, the rough wood grounding her. For a moment, she just sat there, breathing, in and out. The simple act of filling her lungs with the clean night air felt like a small rebellion. The music from the barn was a muted thump, a heartbeat for a party she no longer belonged to. She was an astronaut who had become untethered, floating in a silent, dark space, watching her world spin on without her. The initial shock was beginning to recede, replaced by a cold, hard anger. It was a different kind of anger than she had ever known. It wasn't the fleeting frustration of a forgotten anniversary or a disagreement over finances. This was a deep structural rage, a fury that settled into her bones. It was the anger of a builder who had spent 15 years laying bricks, only to find out the foundation was made of sand. She thought of Jack, her sweet, innocent nephew, who had unknowingly detonated a bomb in the middle of her life. He had seen something wrong, something that didn't fit, and with the simple, unwavering logic of a child, he had pointed it out. He had told the truth, and it was the truth that had ripped everything apart. Sarah felt a surge of love for the boy so fierce it almost brought her to tears. He had given her a painful, terrible gift. Her mind replayed the image of the red shoe, the sheer audacity of it. At her brother's wedding, at the head table. It wasn't a crime of passion. It was an act of breathtaking arrogance. It was a power play, and Chloe had been holding all the cards. She had gambled on Sarah's ignorance, on her complacency, on her unwillingness to cause a scene. And she had won. For now. Sarah pulled her wrap tighter around her shoulders, a fragile defense against the chill that had nothing to do with the temperature. What was she supposed to do? Confront Michael tonight? Scream and rage and turn this celebration into a battlefield? The thought was tempting. The desire to see his handsome, deceitful face crumble in the face of her fury was a powerful lure. But what then? They would become a spectacle, the talk of the family for years to come. Her brother's wedding would be forever tainted by their drama. She couldn't do that to Robert. No. Tonight, she had to be strategic. Tonight, she had to play a different game. Chloe wanted to fight a war in the shadows, to win through whispers and secret smiles. Sarah realized she couldn't win that war by charging onto the battlefield with a sword. She had to learn a new kind of warfare. The sound of footsteps on the gravel path made her stiffen. A dark silhouette emerged from the glow of the barn, moving towards her. For a heart-stopping second, she thought it was Michael. Or worse, Chloe. But as the figure drew closer, she recognized the familiar, slightly stooped posture of her mother. Her mother, a woman of quiet strength and profound pragmatism, stopped a few feet from the bench. She held a small plate with a slice of wedding cake on it. "I thought you might be hungry," she said, her voice calm and even. She sat down next to Sarah, leaving a respectful distance between them. They sat in silence for a moment, the only sound the chirping of crickets in the grass. "It's a beautiful wedding," Sarah said finally, her voice thin. "It is," her mother agreed. She didn't press. She just waited. She had always had a gift for waiting, for letting the truth surface in its own time. Sarah looked at her mother's hands resting in her lap. They were hands that had baked thousands of cookies, tended countless scraped knees, and held her own father's hand for 45 years, until the day he died. They were hands that knew the landscape of a long marriage, its sunlit peaks and its hidden valleys. "He's having an affair," Sarah said. The words came out flat and devoid of emotion, like a weather report. Her mother didn't gasp. She didn't exclaim in shock or disbelief. She simply turned her head and looked at Sarah, her eyes full of a deep, sorrowful understanding. She reached out and placed her hand over Sarah's. Her touch was firm, a steady anchor in the churning sea of Sarah's emotions. "I know," she said softly. Sarah's head snapped up. "What? You knew?" "I suspected," her mother clarified gently. "A mother sees things. The way he looks at you when he thinks you're not watching. The way he doesn't look at you when you are. The little distances. They start small, but they grow. I've seen it before." The confession hung in the air between them, more shocking to Sarah than the affair itself. Her own mother had seen the cracks in her perfect marriage, cracks she herself had been blind to. The humiliation was a fresh, hot wave. "Why didn't you say anything?" Sarah whispered, the accusation sharp. "It wasn't my place," her mother said, her voice full of a weary wisdom. "And what would I have said? Sarah, I think your husband is a liar? Would you have believed me? Or would you have hated me for planting a seed of doubt? This is a truth a person has to find on their own. And now you have." She squeezed Sarah's hand. "The question is not what he has done, my dear. The question is, what are you going to do now?" Her mother's question hung in the cool night air, simple and devastating. What are you going to do now? For the last hour, Sarah had been drowning in the what had happened. She had been a victim of Michael's betrayal, a passive observer of Chloe's triumph. But her mother's words shifted the very ground beneath her feet. They handed the power back to her. The future was not a foregone conclusion written by her husband and his mistress. It was a blank page, and she was the one holding the pen. She looked at the slice of untouched cake on the plate in her mother's lap. It was a perfect triangle of white frosting and delicate sponge, a symbol of a celebration she couldn't taste, a joy she couldn't feel. But she would not let them take her appetite for life. "I'm not going to give them the satisfaction of a scene," Sarah said, her voice finding a new, steely strength. "I'm not going to ruin my brother's wedding. And I'm not going to let that woman think she has won." A slow, proud smile touched her mother's lips. "Good," she said, giving Sarah's hand a final, firm squeeze before taking the plate and standing up. "Your father always said the best revenge is living a life they can't touch. Go live it." She turned and walked back toward the barn, leaving Sarah alone with her newfound resolve. Sarah took a few more deep breaths, not of desperation, but of preparation. She was no longer the trembling woman who had fled the party. She was a general surveying the battlefield, planning her campaign. She stood up, smoothed down her dress, and began walking back to the barn. With every step, she could feel the fear and humiliation being burned away by the cold fire of her anger. When she re-entered the reception hall, the party was still in full swing. The band was playing a loud, fast song, and the dance floor was a chaotic swirl of motion. She spotted Michael immediately. He was standing near the bar, talking to one of his cousins. He looked relaxed, smiling, a drink in his hand. He hadn't come looking for her. The thought, which would have wounded her an hour ago, now merely fueled her resolve. He was comfortable in his deceit. That was his weakness. Her eyes found Chloe. She was on the edge of the dance floor, laughing with a group of friends. As Sarah watched, Chloe's eyes flickered toward Michael at the bar, a quick, possessive glance. She was checking on her prize. Sarah didn't hide. She didn't scurry back to her seat. She walked directly toward the bar, her path taking her right past Chloe's group. As she passed, she let her gaze meet Chloe's. She did not offer a smile, a glare, or any sign of distress. She simply looked at her, a direct, unblinking stare that held a universe of unspoken knowledge. She saw a flicker of surprise in Chloe's eyes, a momentary faltering of her confident smirk. It was a small victory, but it was a start. She reached the bar and stood beside her husband. "Having fun?" she asked, her tone light and conversational. Michael turned, a look of relief washing over his face. "There you are. I was getting worried." "Everything okay?" "Everything is perfectly clear," Sarah said, her voice smooth as silk. She ordered a glass of water from the bartender. She looked at Michael, at his handsome, familiar face. She saw the lie in his eyes, the carefully constructed mask of the loving husband. And for the first time, she wasn't afraid of it. She saw it for what it was, a pathetic, fragile thing. She took a sip of her water. "You know," she said casually, turning her body slightly so she could see both him and Chloe in her periphery. "I was just admiring Chloe's shoes earlier. That shade of red is so bold. It takes a certain kind of woman to wear a shoe like that. Someone who isn't afraid to step on a few toes to get what she wants." She saw it. A subtle tensing in Michael's jaw. His smile became fixed. His eyes darted from Sarah to Chloe and back again. The confident, relaxed man was gone, replaced by someone who was suddenly, terrifyingly aware that the game had changed. He didn't know how she knew. He just knew that she did. Sarah gave him a bright, empty smile. "I'm going to go congratulate Robert again," she said, placing a hand briefly on his arm. The touch was cold. "You enjoy your drink." She walked away, leaving him standing at the bar, the certainties of his world crumbling around him. She knew the fight was far from over. There would be shouting matches, tears, and ugly truths still to be unearthed. The comfortable life she had known was over. But as she walked toward her brother, a genuine smile finally reaching her lips, she felt something she hadn't felt all night. She felt free. The fortress of her marriage may have been built on sand, but she was standing on solid rock, the rock of her own strength, and she would not be moved. If this story has touched your heart, share it with someone who needs a message of hope and the strength to face their own truth. Sometimes the deepest betrayals can lead to the most profound discoveries about ourselves, revealing a power we never knew we had.